Okay, okay. Okay, about 30 seconds. Okay, thank you. Please tell us your name and where and when you were born.
My name is Thomas Grossman, Grossman, spelled in Hungarian Groszman. I was born in Budapest, 1927, May 1st.
Okay, did you live in Budapest your whole life?
No, actually I haven't. I was born in Budapest because, basically because the facilities for birth and all that was much safer in the capital city than anywhere else.
Okay, tell us about your parents and your early family life.
My father was a retired officer from the Royal Hungarian Railroads and Army, which was actually basically a joint venture back in those days. The railroads were controlled by the government and the army as such, indirectly. And my mother was staying at home mostly, rearing my two sisters and myself.
Okay, tell us about your family life when you were growing up. What was the Jewish community like?
Well, we lived in a small town in the Tokaj area, which is famous of its wine production. My father, after retiring from the railroads shortly after World War I, went into a business of wine production and wood business of various different kind, namely firewood production and also railroad ties.
Okay. Tell us about your what type of school you went to, and did you live in an all-Jewish environment, or was it a...
That was not really such thing as that in our cities or villages or towns. There was not strictly a Jewish environment. It was pretty much assimilated at all times, except maybe the super Orthodox. They sort of lived for themselves, but even their children went to public schools and associated with non-Jewish children. The balance of the community, of course, the Jewish community was divided to more or less two parts. One was an Orthodox community, and one was a super Orthodox, which was Beit HaMidrash part that was very Hasidic and quite religious group. We were all knowing one another and living in a small town of a population of 4,000. Everybody knew everybody.
About 4,000.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So your school was attended by both Jewish children and Gentile
Right.
children. Mm-hmm. Was there any anti-Semitism growing up?
There were always anti-Semitism in Hungary. Mm-hmm. That went with the territory, so to speak.
How did that impinge on your daily life?
Well, unfortunately, which was the wrong thing to do by our parents to tell us not to pay attention to it, which is the worst thing to do. You do need to pay attention to it.
For instance, what type of, were there rules, or was it Jewish people just slighted by teachers or shopkeepers? What are some...
Well, we were never slighted by teachers as such, not openly, not in front of a class or anything like that. If we were slighted by our classmates or some of our classmates' parents or something like that, but not by our teachers. That wasn't a policy. We did have school prayers, which was mandatory in all Hungarian schools, but it was strangely enough, a totally non-denominational prayer. Never said anything about neither this religion's God nor the others. Never anything was mentioned except the Catholic kids was making the sign of the cross, and the Protestant kids were standing there with their hands held together, and the Jewish kids was just standing straight, but saying the prayers.
So the discrimination was more on a private level rather than institutionalized type
At that
of
time,
thing.
yes.
How did things change, or did things change in your town after the war broke out?
Well, it was quite a bit of difference. In the first place, even before the war broke out officially, 1938, under the regime of Kalman Darani, we had the first so-called Jewish law, which was a pretty, I would say hefty, but yet not, comparing to other things, not too bad of discriminatory law. And yet it was the beginning, because at that time they already started out with not granting business licenses, new business licenses to new Jewish enterprises, not letting Jewish students go to universities except in what you called numerus clausus, which entailed a certain percentage, and which eventually followed into high schools and colleges, in addition to professional universities like engineering and colleges and other places.
So at one time, even Jewish children were prevented from entering high schools.
That came later on.
About when? Do you remember?
That came actually in the not mid, but the early 40s. By that time, we had the new entry level was 6%.
So only 6% of the students could be Jewish.
Right. Up until that was 20%, which was absolutely no problem. Because it was always less than 20% who wanted to enter high school.
When did things begin to get worse?
Things was really gotten worse in the like 41 and 42, that we had different heads of states, like prime ministers who was imposing stiffer laws and imposing work camps to Jews. The Jewish man was expelled from the Hungarian army and sent to what you called labor camps instead of army. But still, that was not a concentration camp. It was a different level. It was like an army, but strictly Jews, and it had to wear a yellow armband.
What type of laws were passed that restricted your own daily life as a child and with your family?
Basically, what restricted me was really none. I have not felt or wasn't affected of any of these laws because of my father's position as a retired person from railroad and army, and in his deeds of to the Hungarian government, various different things, that he was exempted from all laws that was discriminatory against Jews.
Did you have to carry special papers showing that you were exempt from these laws?
No.
Or
Not really.
how did they know to enforce it with the family here but not with your family?
Well, basically, when you lived in a small town, everybody knew you, so nobody really bothered you as such, like from the police or from the townhouse officials or city hall or something like that.
Mm-hmm. When did things begin to change for your family also?
It began to change, and it changed like overnight in 1944, and that was after the overrun of the Nazi Army of Hungary, March 16, 1944.
And what were the changes that you remember?
Well, changes were devastating.
Tell us about
immediately schools were closed. All Jewish children was expelled from school. We had curfews to abide by. We could not go out in the streets. We were told to wear a yellow star. It was in chronological order, so to speak. Okay, 1944, March 16th, I was living in a town called Kasha. It was formerly part of Czechoslovakia. Now, again, is Czechoslovakian territory. The city called Košice. I was a high school student there, boarding. In the small towns in Hungary, there were no high schools, and high schools were somewhat higher level in academic achievements and academic requirements than high schools in this country. Those schools were called gymnasium, which is not the same as a gymnasium here. To illustrate you something, we started first year of gymnasium, and after 4 years of public school, and immediately had Latin. They have 8 years of Latin. Third years of school, we had 2 more foreign languages and algebra, pretty heavy. In the 4th grade of the gymnasium, we already had second degree equation and calculus and things of that nature in the mathematics level, and physics and so on and so forth. So it was a pretty heavy curriculum as such, but we were used to it. That's the way the educational system worked.
Okay, so when March 16th arrived, you were away at boarding school.
Right. I was in Košice. I attended my 6th grade of gymnasium, and we were the day before, we were celebrating, which was March 15th, we were celebrating the March 15th revolution of the Hungarians against the Austrian regime, and which was 1944, and the revolution took place in 1848. and everybody was happy and gay that we achieved what we achieved, that Hungary was free. And ironically enough, next day we were SS tanks and Wehrmacht boots marching on the streets again. Of course, schools were immediately closed, and we were advised to, those of us who were not actually living in that town, to pack up and go home to our respective parental homes, which I did. And everything was relatively calm and for 2 or 3 days, and then the different little things came about, like we had advertisement or told us, that little town, for instance, we had no radio or radio communication. They had a man who came out with a drum and beat the drum, and then he was the town crier, what they called, and told everybody what the new laws are. And he was telling everybody that all men and women of the Jewish faith now will have to display a yellow, not the yellow star, but they have to stay in their homes between 6 in the morning and 6 at night. We could not get out of our homes. Of course, that was a method to their madness, because the stores didn't open until 8 o'clock, and they closed at 5:30 or 6. So after that, we could not go out and do any kind of shopping. Mm-hmm. So if we didn't have anything stored in our homes, food-wise, any kind of reserves, then we were in pretty bad trouble. If most of us, when we lived in a small town like that, you had your own little vegetable gardens and animals and so on and so forth. So you were really not in any kind of immediate danger of starving. But there were some people, sick and old, that was really started suffering hardship, and that was the bad part about it. Then 6 or 7 days later came about to announcing the every Jewish member of the town have to report to the town hall and turn in their mechanized vehicles, whether it was a bicycle or a motorcycle or car or anything of that sort, including their jewelry and rings, watches, and whatever that entailed. The next thing was 2-3 days later is the announcement of wearing the yellow star, at which point the curfew was lowered. We could go out during the day by having the yellow star displayed. That lasted about a week. A week later, we were told that we can expect some other changes. These changes were not told what it was, but the following night, the Hungarian military police knocked on our doors about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and at gunpoint ordered us to get 2 days of change. Just put on what we have on, get 2 days of change of underwear, and get out of your home. And whereupon my father was, of course, was got very indignant and told the men to get the hell out of there. That's his home, and the men told him, you damn Jew, you don't have any home. That's not yours anymore. Just get out. And we were herded into the local synagogue, where we stayed for about a little more than 48 hours. Everybody jammed up. The old, the sick, the infant and everybody else. No facilities could be used because there were no facilities inside in the synagogue in Hungary. First of all, that could not be done because of not an Orthodox synagogue. So it had to be outside, but they did not let you go outside, so you can imagine what took place. So the place was totally desecrated as a result. Like I said, 48 hours later, or maybe a little more, I think we spent 3 nights and 2 days, we were herded down to the railroad station and hurled into boxcars and taken into provincial capital called Shatarol Yahuihei. There was makeshift ghettos set up.
Mm-hmm. What was the train like on your way there?
Train wasn't, there was just boxcars, nothing too bad at that time because the whole ride wasn't more than about 2.5 hours, so it wasn't really bad and wasn't really that crowded, if I remember correctly. Maybe hurled in about 50, 55 or 60 people in the boxcar. It shouldn't normally take more than 40, 45. When I tell you the story later on, that gets a whole lot worse. But I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Good.
We finally arrived to this place. Their private homes were evacuated for the purpose of setting up a provincial ghetto, which was for the whole province of Zemplén. And Zemplén was like a state of, we can compare like South Carolina. I mean, it was a little bit different structure and infrastructure and setup, but basically there was a governor and a lieutenant governor and so on and so forth, and various different political entities that went into that. And we stayed there for 6 weeks in about a 12 by 12 little room, holding about 15 or 16 people, person, in which we had to sleep and stay in and so on. And towards the end of the 6th week, actually, let me correct this, about 3 weeks later, we started hearing the stories about we will be taken out of the ghettos and taken to the southern part of Hungary, where we going to be performing agricultural work to help the war effort of the glorious German and Hungarian army to win the war against the horrible United States and England and so on and so forth. And the transports has started. Three transport came off, and we were landing in the 4th. There were different kind of efforts made to get my family out of the transports to being sent away, because whoever handled the case to help us not to be sent knew exactly where we were going, even though they wouldn't tell us. After we were taken out to the railroad station and hurled into boxcars again, one of my sisters were with us, my mother, father, and one of my sisters. And my other sister were married at the time in the same town where I was going to school, as a matter of fact, Košice. And we were just pushed into these boxcars, about 80 people at this time, not 50. And all of a sudden, my oldest sister reappeared. I mean, just appeared from nowhere. And in the company of an SS soldier, and was put in the boxcar with us. And we were totally amazed because we couldn't understand where she come from, and she explained to us that her husband were taken to one of these labor camps, and the soldier who was in SS uniform, he was basically a friend of the family. He was a local boy, but of German heritage, and he joined the SS when the Nazis occupied Hungary, and he was really helpful to her family. I don't know how much harm he done elsewhere. But nevertheless, she came and joined us. And the thing that struck me, and I remarked to my father that is one thing that I don't understand, Dad. If we go into southern Hungary to perform agricultural work, how come these engines on the end of this train pointing north? It so happens that the provincial capital, Sátoraljaújhely, was also a border town to Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia was north, it still is north of Hungary. And there was no doubt in our minds that we are not going to southern Hungary, but we're heading to Poland, which indeed it happened. In the meantime, while we were in the ghetto, of course, it was different things happened. It was very frightening. They pulled out people to go to work, to do this and that, and these men never returned. And we have heard occasional shots and different things. Many other people, young people, men, women was badly beaten. And it was a rather frightening experience. I could spend a lot of time to talk about it, but I don't think we have too much time to do that. The next stop, of course, after...
Was your family personally mistreated in the ghetto? No, but you saw it around you. Mm-hmm.
No, they were actually never mistreated.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There was one... We were beaten a few times when we were actually hurled up to the train at the side of the provincial capital from the ghetto. Mm-hmm. But that was the only thing, but it was not anything severe. But nevertheless, it was a beating. Mm-hmm. After about 3 days, it took about 72 hours plus train ride to our destination, we arrived to Auschwitz. And how that was figured out and calculated is still beyond me, but that was calculated so that we get there right in the middle of the night, like 3 o'clock. It was pitch dark, and it was absolutely more frightening and more dramatic to get out of a boxcar than it would be 8 o'clock in the morning or something like that. We had 80 people put into that car approximately, or maybe more. We had some people died during old people died and during the trip, which was very unfortunate. Here again were absolutely no facilities, and you just had to take care of yourself best you could. The cars were sealed. There's no way to even look out. When the cars rolled through stations, nobody knew what it was because just sped through stations. Occasionally we were pulled aside to let other trains pass us. You know, it's very strange. The other night I was listening to a program with Elie Wiesel, and he was making a statement that they, toward the final solution days, they were so obsessed that they let army trains pull aside to make trains go to deportation trains go to faster to the concentration camps or places like Auschwitz or other places. Well, I did not experience that. I'm not saying that's not so. It could have been so, but at the time we were pulled off to let other trains pass by. I know that for a fact. It could be so, but I find this hard to believe, basically, because I don't think even for the Nazis was that important to let Jews suffer in the boxcar that they would let their precious army trains to sit aside. So that is somewhat, but it could, anything can happen. I'm not saying that it didn't. When we arrived to Auschwitz, like I told you, that was a very frightening experience. There was this SS running around with ferocious-looking German shepherds and dogs, and tried to hurl off everybody from the boxcar, then they were beating us off of that car. They weren't just asking us to come down and hurry up, but they were actually coming up in that boxcar and beating everybody as where they could reach them. That was unbelievable. The cruelty of these people are beyond human imagination. And anybody today who makes a statement that the Holocaust did not exist and it's only an overactive imagination of Jewish people, anybody who makes this statement ought to seek mental examination, because it did happen. I was there, and I do not have an overactive imagination. And that person can come to me and talk to me about it. And I tell him anytime what happened, and I tell him anytime where to go. On top of it, I promise you that person will never get lost in his life after that, because I'll direct him exactly where I want him to go. So much for that. The next thing is that when we were finally hurled off of that car, those boxcars, we saw that humongous sign that said, it was, when we actually thought that we were in Auschwitz, we were not in Auschwitz. We were outside of Auschwitz. There was a gate, like the Arch of Triumph, and was written over it, Arbeit macht frei, which means labor makes you free. Yep. I don't want to comment on it. But at that gate, there stood a tall SS colonel, or he may have been captain. I'm not exactly sure. I wasn't too familiar at that time with the rank insignias. And he were standing up and pointing like this. And this man was Dr. Mengele. And he was pointing the old and the women, the pregnant women, and young children, and mother with young children, and older people who he felt that were unable to work, to the left, and the able-bodied, quote unquote, to the right. And we were told, when we asked where we're going, those of us who spoke any German, which I did, we were told we are going to take some showers and we'll be deliced. I asked, why should we delice? We have no lice. Well, I got a tremendous slap in the face when I made that statement. I was told to shut up and just go. We were standing in block of column of 5 and ordered to march. We were going into some big rooms, tremendous rooms with pipes going all over the place with shower heads coming off the pipes. And we were asked to strip, leave our clothes there. There were some, and go, just step aside, and there were some people who came with some hand shear and sheared us, all our hair off our bodies, our hair, our head, and everything, and made us change into. We could keep our underwear, but then in our shirt, and some of us could keep our shoes. Those were a little fortunate. Others had to take. Their shoes were even taken to give them some wooden shoes of some kind. And then we had to change into these stripe suits, and gave us a cap of this striped cap of sort. So it was like a prisoner's suit, and after we were given these stuff, we were told to put these things down that we were given. We were given a little round piece of it was a piece of hard paper what was framed with some light metal with a number in it, which was from there on our prisoner number that we had to memorize, we were told. And then we would go stepping into the shower. And since I'm here, you know that the shower was legitimate. Some of the others was not that fortunate. Some of the others who were hurled into the shower were told they're going to be cleaned and bathed. They had cyclone gas coming out of the shower and died the most horrible death that you can think of and you can possibly imagine. And the horrible part of it is that the cyclone gas specific weight is a good bit lighter than air. No, I'm sorry, heavier than air. And the fresh air was going up and the gas was going down. As a result, everybody was, excuse me, everybody's climbing up on top of everybody else to gasp for the fresh air to be able to stay alive until this hall actually was filled up totally with gas, and everybody was killed.
Mm-hmm. Did your whole family get sent to the right, or did some of them get sent to the left?
No, my whole family was sent to the right.
To the right.
And so my father and myself ended up in one place, and my mother and my two sisters ended up in another place. We have seen them briefly after the showers to march off one direction, and we were marched to another direction. So we actually never went into Auschwitz, neither one of us. We stayed in Birkenau. Mm-hmm. Now, Birkenau was a horrible place. It was one of these transient camps, and people were just there to waiting for transports over to various different places. And so my father and I was shipped from there to a place in Oberschlesien called Oberwüstergersdorf. It was a small mining town that we were shipped to, and we were working in a stone quarry. Actually, inside of the mountain, we were building an airport, an airstrip, a landing strip, and also takeoff, obviously. And we stayed there from basically from last of April of 1944 until February 1945. During the time, of course, we were changed to two different camps, but somehow or the other we were ended back up in the same place again. During the time while we were in that camp, various things happened of different atrocities of various different kind. But basically this was a work camp, and not much of the infamous killings or anything like that took place. A couple of people tried to escape. They hung him with an open display. I one time stepped outside the gate purely as an accident. I was saw something and tried to picked it up, and I was shot at. Fortunately, nothing happened. I wasn't hit, but nonetheless, I was shot at. So I got back. I was severely reprimanded and bodily punished. 1945 February, we were experiencing something very curious. Things, we have seen some very interesting things happening. We have heard thunder and lightning, which was rather peculiar in North Germany, northeastern Germany, which was northeastern Germany at the time. And at that time of the year, that was beyond our imagination that we could hear thunder and lightning. And that was, of course, not any thunder and lightning, but it was the heavy artillery of the Russian army that we have seen. During the time, because I like to mention this as well, while we were in these labor camps, we had several selections. People who got rather skinny and undernourished, they were selected out and sent back to Auschwitz. And that was the first time, actually, we have really learned, when we have found out that they're being sent back to Auschwitz, what was really taking place in Auschwitz. At the time when we arrived, we had no idea what that fantastic red sky meant, the flames and the stench of burning flesh. We had no idea what that come from, and we never experienced anything like that. And we have found out as we were there that some of the guards who were old and talkative and just tell us, you won't behave, you're going to end up like your buddies there. So what are you talking about? Well, they were sent back to Auschwitz and it's going to be burned. What do you mean burned? Well, don't you know what's going on? I said, no, how would we know? Who would tell us? So he actually told us that these people will be sent back to Auschwitz, be gassed, and cremated. And so when we arrived and we saw all this fantastic flames and the sky red and everything else, that's what we saw.
Were you still with your father at this point?
Yes. So February 1945, like I told you, we've seen this artillery mirages, which we have thought at first was thunder and lightning. The Nazis decided that they're going to have to evacuate the camp, and everybody who were able to walk or march will have to go. And my father at this point, unfortunately, was not able to walk, so he was left behind in a barrack for the sick, and the rest of us were taken on a trip on foot. And this trip took 2 weeks. We were marching 700 of us. 2 weeks later, or maybe a little more, maybe a little less, I'm not 100% sure. At this point, we arrived to a camp called Flossenburg. 200 of us. The rest of them was either just died on the roadside or shot to death by the SS. If they could not walk, or they refused to walk because they were too tired, they just simply shot at the back of their neck. And that was the end of it. Flossenburg was an unbelievable concentration camp. It wasn't only a Vernichtungslager, which means a total elimination camp, but were also set up to torture, to starve, to beat, to reduce people to an absolute subhuman level. The slightest punishment for anything you have done that was a crime in the Nazis' opinion was hanging. When we were marched into this camp, we have to file by 12 people hanging. We had to look at it for various different crimes, and then we have to be called for a Zählappell, which was a normal occurrence in the concentration camps anyway, but this was just unreal of any camp I ever been to, because we were called to a roll call for 5:30 in the morning, and we stood outside, rain or shine or snow or sleet or whatever, until about 10 o'clock in the morning. And then they let you go back to your barrack, and they called you out again for something else. This wasn't a work camp. They just had you there to slowly kill you. One day I volunteered for a work detail because I just couldn't stand sitting in these barracks and every day waking up with somebody dying next to me. Every morning I woke up to a corpse next to me, or pretty much so anyway. I volunteered to work, so they let me work to unload trucks of various different kind. Here came a truck bringing food for the SS. They brought in big baskets, like wash baskets, laundry baskets, full of bread. So I took one. I knew if I get caught, I'd probably get killed. Well, I didn't care, because I was so hungry. I haven't seen a piece of bread for I don't know how long. So I just took one. And sure enough, I got caught, because somebody saw me to take it, and he wanted half of it, and I gave him half of it, and 3 others jumped, and I ended up with nothing, but that was reported. So I was sentenced to be hanged. Well, I was fortunate because a delegation from the Swiss Red Cross came in, and all the over-exaggerated punishments had to stop. But they shipped me out of that camp next day by a train with a bunch of other guys. And we ended up in Dresden, Germany. It was a work camp. They gave us a little food. They took us out every day to work on the streets. The detail I worked with, we went to the railroad station that was bombed to shreds by the American Air Force. You know, it was a beautiful sight. I enjoyed cleaning up the rubble. I was just wishing that they had done a little more than that. So we were there for about, I think 2 or 3 weeks, something like this. During this time, while I was in Dresden, I had a very curious experience. One day they wanted me to come and peel potatoes, which I did, and there was a young SS guard was sitting there, and he was sitting there across the yard from me and peeling an apple, and he had a knife, and when I'd seen him to peel an apple, I just felt so craving for that apple, you know, I couldn't keep my eyes off of him. And I must have looked kind of hateful at him, you know. He must have felt something that it wasn't pleasant coming from me. So he came over and asked me what I'm looking at. I said, I'm looking at you. He said, don't look, I cut your eyes out. And he actually took his knife that he had and aimed it to my eye, and I just bent my head down real quick, and he cut a piece off my eye here, so I still have that scar. And then, for some strange reason, 2 days later, I was shipped out of there too. And we ended up, well, actually, at this point, we weren't shipped out. We were really marching. Partially, no, we'd been taking a train from Dresden, and then taken off the train and started marching. During the march, we had 2 air raids. And then we had a very bad episode. One time I had been together with a very dear friend of mine who was also my classmate, and I was kind of aiding him. And one day while we were marching on the road, a horse-drawn flatbed wagon comes up with 2 SS men, and asked us, who is tired that wants to ride the flatbed? And my friend said, I'm going. I said, no, you're not. Yes, I am. You don't be crazy. You come too. I said, no, I'm not going. I'm absolutely not going. And you don't go either. Oh, come on, don't be silly. So he went. And so did 25 others, all around, sitting around on those flatbed, and some in the middle of the flatbed. And then the two S's took off. And they took off the road. The horses started running, galloping, or trotting, whatever. Then they veered off to the left. I remember like it was today, into the woods. And all of a sudden I hear the submachine gun going off. And these two bastards are coming back and asking, smiling, says, anybody wants a buggy ride? So we kept on marching. About 2 days later, I arrived to a camp called Light Merits. It's in Czechoslovakia. Name today is Litomerice. This was pretty well in beginning of April at this point. And